of the president. Okay, before we talk about the burial, when it came to the decision or question of where President Kennedy was going to be buried, it was Jackie that made the final decision. Most of the Kennedy family members wanted him to be buried where?
Boston.
In Massachusetts, okay? But she made the final decision, and this decision was made on an event when President Kennedy had visited Arlington Cemetery during his presidency. And it was just a week before his assassination. So again, Mrs. Kennedy made the final decision that he would be buried in Arlington, despite the fact that a lot of the Kennedy family would have rather had him buried in Massachusetts. And her decision was based on a visit that President Kennedy had made to Arlington just 1 week before his assassination. Now, this is kind of cool because you'll get a chance. He was standing in front of the Arlington House, which is a house that was owned by Robert E. Lee, and Arlington House has an incredible view of the city. You can see the Washington Monument, you can see the Jefferson Memorial, you can see the Lincoln Memorial. It's just an incredible view that you will get an opportunity to see. And he just marveled at that view and made comments on how much he enjoyed the view from the Arlington House. So the weekend after the assassination, Clint Hill escorted Mrs. Kennedy back to Arlington, and she picked the spot that would be the final resting place for her husband, which is right below the hill. If you look at if you're standing in front of the Arlington House, it's right exactly below at the bottom of the hill. So again, in recapping this, when the question came of where they were going to bury the president, most of the members of the Kennedy family preferred that he be buried in Boston or the Massachusetts area. But Mrs. Kennedy made the final decision. That was her right as the wife, and she based that decision on the president's visit just a week before his assassination to Arlington. And he stood on the front of the Arlington House and looked out and marveled at the view. And she felt that would be the best place for him. So Secret Service agent Clint Hill escorted Mrs. Kennedy to Arlington the weekend after the assassination, and she picked the spot. Okay? And you'll get a chance to be there. So, on Monday, November 25th, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy began his long journey to Arlington Cemetery. And I'll give you the timeline and tell you how it went. Again, on Monday, November 25th, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy began his long journey to Arlington Cemetery. What time did they shut people down from paying their respects? 10 a.m. At 10:40 a.m., Robert Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, and Jackie Kennedy arrived at the Capitol and entered the rotunda. At 10:40 a.m., Robert Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, and Jackie Kennedy all arrived at the Capitol and entered the rotunda. All three knelt and prayed at the casket, then slowly rose and left the rotunda. All three knelt and prayed at the casket, then slowly rose and left the rotunda. At 10:45 a.m., President Kennedy's casket was removed from the Capitol Rotunda, taken down the steep steps of the Capitol by 8 chosen enlisted military men. So at 10:45 a.m., President Kennedy's casket was removed from the Capitol Rotunda, taken down the steep steps of the Capitol by 8 chosen enlisted military men who served as casket bearers. Now, if you've ever seen the steps of the Capitol, if you've been there, I don't know, maybe you have or not. If you have not, you will. They are incredibly steep. And the president's casket was very heavy. And so this was a chore for these body bearers. Timothy Cheap, who at the time, and here's Timothy Cheek right here in a picture, taking the casket down the steps. Yeah, Timothy Cheek, a 20-year-old Marine, was quoted as saying this, and again, you don't have to write the quote down, but you should listen. So body bearer Timothy F. Cheek, this fellow right here, signed, who was just a 20-year-old Marine at the time, was quoted as saying this, and again, you just have to listen. Quote, "I was in a trance. We were kids, totally focused on doing our duty as well as we could. My thought during my duty was, don't drop the casket, especially down the steep rotunda stairs. One falter and that casket was gone." Very, very heavy. Another Army Sergeant, James L. Felder, this is what he was quoted as saying. Quote, "This was the part we were all frightened of. We wet our gloves and prepared, took a grip. We got it down the steps no problem, breathed a sigh of relief, and put it onto the caisson." So there was some huge concern about the weight of the casket and the steep stairs. It was a battle. Well, at 10:50 a.m., the processional began its journey from the Capitol to Arlington Cemetery. At 10:50 a.m., the processional or parade began its journey from the Capitol to Arlington National Cemetery. Now the caisson was put, the body was put on a caisson where the president's casket rested during the parade route. And Jackie Kennedy planned for the riderless horse, called Blackjack, to walk behind the caisson. So behind the caisson where the president's casket rested during the parade route was Blackjack, which was a riderless horse with empty reversed boots in the stirrups, which signified a fallen leader, which was done the same way in the Lincoln funeral. So I'll repeat that again. Behind the caisson, where President Kennedy's casket rests during the parade route, was Blackjack, the riderless horse with empty reversed boots in the stirrups to signify a fallen leader. You'll get a chance to see this on video. If he's a riderless horse, what does he have to be? Led. And the person that led him was Private First Class Arthur Carlson, 19 years old, a member of the Old Guard. And here is Arthur Carlson right here. Here's a picture of Blackjack. Here's a picture of Arthur Carlson and his signature. So the man that led Blackjack, the riderless horse with empty reversed boots in the stirrups to signify a fallen leader, was Private First Class Arthur Carlson, just 19 years old and a member of the Old Guard. Anybody know what the Old Guard is? I mentioned it briefly the other day. The Old Guard are the guys that guard the tomb of the unknown soldier and are involved in military funerals and processions. Well, this is an interesting story because Mrs. Kennedy insisted on walking behind her husband's casket the entire funeral route rather than riding in an automobile. Okay? And she chose that, and so who chose to join her? Robert and Edward Kennedy. Now this was great concern to the Secret Service. We just had a president assassinated. Now you got the Attorney General and a very prestigious senator and the former First Lady walking from the Capitol to Arlington. I don't think you even have a clue how far that is until you'll get a chance to walk it. It's an incredible journey. So Mrs. Kennedy insisted on walking behind her husband's casket the entire funeral route rather than ride in an automobile. As a result, Robert and Edward Kennedy also joined her in the processional, great concern to the Secret Service. Here's an interesting statistic, and I don't know how much you need to write down. Not since the burial of the unknown soldier 40 years before in the tomb of the unknown soldier had there been so many foreign dignitaries in Washington, D.C. Every civilized country in the world, with the exception of China and Albania, had representatives at the Kennedy funeral. Unbelievable. There were so many foreign dignitaries, it was just hard to protect them. And guess what they chose to do as well? Walk with Mrs. Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy. So many of the foreign dignitaries also chose to walk the processional route behind the Kennedy family, again, making security impossibility and a nightmare for the Secret Service. But that's what it was. Unfortunately, it worked out without incident. Well, at 12:14 p.m., the President's coffin entered St. Matthew's Cathedral on Connecticut Avenue, where the funeral mass would take place. At 12:14 p.m., the President's coffin entered St. Matthew's Cathedral, which is on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., where the funeral mass would take place. How many Catholics do we have in here? Okay, you understand that? Okay, should be a tremendous thrill for you to get a chance to go to St. Matthew's Cathedral, and if we have mass for you to go to, we'll let you do that if you want. But it's an incredible church. Anyway, the man that conducted the funeral mass was Archbishop Richard Cardinal Cushing. And there's Cardinal Cushing's picture up there with the signature on the letter. Richard Cardinal Cushing is the man that officiated and conducted the funeral mass for President Kennedy at St. Matthew's Cathedral. Archbishop Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston. Well, Michael, how long do you think mass took?
I'd probably say 2 hours.
A little bit shorter. It was actually a little bit more than an hour, because at 1:21 p.m., following the mass, the body of President Kennedy was placed back on the caisson in front of the church. At 1:21 p.m., following the mass, the casket with the slain president's body inside was placed back on the caisson in front of St. Matthew's Cathedral.
What's spelled caisson?
It's C-A-I-S-S-O-N.
Thank you.
Yep. Waiting on the steps as the casket was secured back on the caisson were family members, and the band played Hail to the Chief as they were doing this. Hail to the Chief.
What time was this?
This is about 1:21 p.m. So at 1:21, following the mass, the body of the slain president was placed back on the caisson in front of the church as family members waited on the steps as the band played Hail to the Chief. At that point, Mrs. Kennedy bent down to her son, John Kennedy Jr., and whispered into his ear. And we'll read this to you. A Little Soldier Salute, Washington, November 25th, UPI. His world was strangely different in little ways a child notices but does not understand. Where is his daddy? The tall man with the laughing blue eyes who had a big desk and saw lots of important people and stooped to spank him good-naturedly and took him on helicopter rides and called him John John. This was supposed to be the day of the party. The cake with 3 candles to blow out, the friends singing happy birthday, the gifts. But this day was different. The soldiers outside, whose salutes he delighted in trying to return one of his own, looked different. They didn't glance down at him and sneak a wink or smile today. Their commands barked, their rifles clattered. They stood at the bottom of the steps. Pallbearers appeared at the door with the flag-draped casket, and as it came slowly toward them, Mrs. Kennedy leaned down and whispered to her son, He stood apart, straightened stiffly, and raised his hand in salute as the casket passed. A little boy at his grieving mother's side saluted the passing casket, and in that moment he suddenly became the brave soldier his father would have wanted him to be on this day of all days. For today, John F. Kennedy Jr. turned 3. His father was buried on his 3rd birthday, and we'll talk about that. Oh, anyway, David Powers, remember David Powers, one of Kennedy's closest aides? He was later quoted as saying this, and again, you don't have to write it down. He was later quoted as saying, "We used to salute around the White House a lot. Heads of state used to come into the White House and John would be in the balcony, even as a little boy, and he'd see them all saluting. He was always great at saluting, except sometimes he would salute with his left hand. But that day, he was perfect." After this emotional event, the processional continued its journey from St. Matthew's Cathedral to Arlington Cemetery, and at 2:54 p.m., the processional arrived at Arlington Cemetery. So again, after this emotional event, the processional continued, arriving at Arlington Cemetery at 2:54 p.m. When the parade reached the burial site chosen by Mrs. Kennedy at Arlington, the Marine Band played the Star-Spangled Banner. And after that was played, the Air Force bagpipes played Mist-Covered Mountain. Bagpipes, signifying what? His Irish heritage. Very good. So when the processional reached the burial site chosen by Mrs. Kennedy at Arlington, the Marine Band played the Star-Spangled Banner, followed by the Air Force bagpipes that played Mist-Covered Mountain. I'll repeat that again. When the processional reached the burial site at Arlington, the Marine Band played the Star-Spangled Banner, followed by the Air Force bagpipes corps, who played Mist-Covered Mountain. You'll get a chance to hear this on video. When that was completed, the casket was removed from the caisson and carried to the grave. There was a sousaphone, is that correct, music people? A sousaphone? A sousaphone player by the name of Ed Simmons in the Marine Band was later quoted as saying this at this moment. So again, Marine Band sousaphone player Ed Simmons was quoted as saying this, quote, "I thought as we were going up to the gravesite, because it was quite a steep hill, that my God, there are muscles I haven't used in months. Probably what sticks in my mind the most was the casket, the humongous weight of it, seeing these body bearers struggling to carry it up the hill to the gravesite. It was an incredible struggle." Again, very heavy, and you'll get a chance to walk up to that site, and you won't be carrying any casket, and you'll wonder, boy, this is getting kind of uphill the whole way. Okay? As the president's body was laid to rest, 50 fighter jets flew over the cemetery, signifying what? 1 for each state. Very good. So as the president's body was laid to rest, 50 fighter jets, representing all 50 states, flew over the cemetery. What were the jets followed by? What flew over after the 50 jets? What? No. Think about the significance, the symbol of the presidency. Air Force One. So the jets were followed up by Air Force One, which was a final tribute to the Commander-in-Chief who had given his life for his country. Remember Assistant Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff? He announced the president's death to the press at Parkland. This is what he was quoted as saying about the burial. Suddenly, seeing this flight of fighters come across, just screaming jets with one plane missing from the formation, that was heart-wrenching. Then Air Force One coming from the same way. I never saw a plane that size fly so low in my life. And it came over and tipped its wings just before it took off and gained altitude. So Air Force One came over the burial site, tipped its wing to the president, and off it went. After that, a 21-gun salute was administered at the burial site, followed by the playing of taps. Anybody know what TAPS is? Okay, you'll get a chance to hear it, and you'll see that the person that was playing TAPS had a little trouble doing that too when we show you the video. So a 21-gun salute was administered, followed by the playing of TAPS. The American flag that draped President Kennedy's coffin was then folded by the military casket bearers and presented to Mrs. Kennedy. Anybody want to know what the final tribute to the fallen leader was? The lighting of the eternal flame at the President's gravesite. So as a final tribute to the fallen leader of the free world, the lighting of the eternal flame at the President's gravesite took place. That occurred at 3:13 p.m. 3:13 p.m. Who took turns lighting the eternal flame? Jackie, Robert, Edward. So at 3:13 p.m., Jackie, Robert, and Ted Kennedy, or Edward Kennedy, all took turns lighting the eternal flame, which still burns brightly today, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Can you repeat what you said with the flag?
Okay, the flag was, after they got done playing taps, the flag was taken off the casket and folded in proper military fashion by the casket bearers, and then presented to Mrs. Kennedy. After that happened, at 3:13 p.m., Jackie Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy all took turns lighting the eternal flame. When asked about the eternal flame, Jackie Kennedy said it paid a personal tribute to her husband, who asked not what his country could do for him, but what he could do for his country. After the burial, the Kennedy party left Arlington Cemetery. Interesting to that, later that night, Secret Service agent Clint Hill escorted both Jackie and Robert Kennedy back to Arlington Cemetery so they could view the burial site and the eternal flame privately. Hill later said they both knelt and prayed for about 15 minutes, then left. You know what else Jackie Kennedy did that day after the funeral? Gave her son a birthday party. So she had a birthday party for John Jr. and celebrated his 3rd birthday. Wouldn't that be interesting to do? She did it because she felt it was very important. Okay? I'm going to give you some final thoughts now on the death of John F. Kennedy. A lot of this is quotes, so you really can just kind of put some things down and listen. Here's some final thoughts and quotes about the life and death of President John F. Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy later, after some reflection, was asked to sum up the life of her husband. And she took a paragraph from his famous book, Profiles in Courage. And this is how she summed up the life of her husband. She said, quote, "The courage of life is often a less dramatic spectacle than the courage of the final moment, but is no less than a magnificent mixture of triumph and tragedy. A man does what he must, in spite of personal consequences, in spite of obstacles and dangers and pressures, and that is the basis of all human morality." So she summed up her husband's life in one of his Profiles in Courage paragraphs. I want to talk about what politicians, friends, media, authors, all kind of inflated what Kennedy did. A president is usually evaluated in his first 1,000 days in office. Okay? Arthur Schlesinger wrote a book called 1,000 Days about Kennedy's administration. But here's basically what the big philosophy of Kennedy was in general. Listen to this and think about it. Quote, "Robbed of his years, he is being rewarded and honored in death as he never was in life. Deprived of the place he sought in history, he has been given a place in legend." True? Probably a lot greater president in death than he may have would have been in life. Who knows? We'll talk about some of that. Okay? Another final thought. When he was in the movie we showed you, the short excerpt of Kennedy, this is one of President Kennedy's quotes that best maybe summed up the tragedy of his death and what could have been. This is what he was quoted as saying one time. "It has been recently suggested that whether I serve 1 or 2 terms in the presidency, I will find myself at the end of that period of what might be called the awkward age. Too old to begin a new career and too young to write my memoirs. And he would have been. If he'd have served 2 terms, he'd have been about 50-ish. And he really would have been too old to maybe start a new career and too young to write his memoirs. Rose Kennedy, let's talk about his mother. After facing how many tragic deaths is this poor woman? And she's got another one coming we haven't even talked about, and that's going to be the assassination of Robert Kennedy. But this is what she said about the many tragic deaths within her family. She said, quote, "It has been said, time heals all wounds. I do not agree. The wounds remain. In time, the mind, protecting its sanity, covers them with scar tissue, and the pain lessens, but it is never gone." It's an interesting quote by Rose Kennedy. Okay, you ever heard of Kennedy and Camelot? Okay, I'm going to tell you the story, and I just want you to listen, okay? You don't necessarily need to write this down. But I want to tell you about the myth of Camelot. Where did that come from? The Kennedy years in the White House have been often referred to as Camelot. How many people have heard of that? Okay? Well, what was Camelot? Anybody know? But yeah, it was a Broadway musical about the court of King Arthur and his knights at the Round Table. And it opened in December 1960, just a few weeks before Kennedy was elected. Okay, and this was this Broadway musical called Camelot. And the Kennedy administration was often compared to that imaginary place with high ideals and chivalry and knights in shining armor of this medieval legend that was known as Camelot. And that's the reason John F. Kennedy's time in office is referred to as Camelot. Now, the Kennedys were the closest thing to royalty this country ever saw. If we'd had a king and queen in America, they would have been the king and queen. We don't have that, okay? We have a president. Anyway, here's how this came about. Jackie Kennedy asked a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist by the name of Theodore H. White to the family compound at Hyannisport, Massachusetts, a week after her her husband's death. Now, Theodore White had become a confidant of the president during his 1960 presidential campaign and a friend. And Jackie wanted to have Theodore White rescue Jack Kennedy from, quote, the bitter old men who write history. Now think about that. She sought to have Theodore White rescue her husband from, quote, the bitter old men who write history. So Mrs. Kennedy struggled to find what she considered an appropriate metaphor, or classical metaphor, for her husband's presidency. So in the echoes of a favorite Broadway musical of the time, Jacqueline Kennedy found her heroic metaphor and cast the spell of Camelot over the American people with the help of White. And White wrote an essay that was 1,000 words long, which isn't very long, and it became the defining moment in America's political and cultural life. Did people refer to the Kennedy presidency at Camelot when he was alive? No. After his death, the Kennedy presidency became known as Camelot, comparing to King Arthur and his court, and an infamous time in medieval history, and how kings and jubilants and cherished times. Mrs. Kennedy set that up. Mrs. Kennedy's the one that brought that to American history after his death. And so that's why you hear the myth of Camelot. Okay, I'm going to give you some tidbits on the Kennedy assassination. You don't have to write these down either. This is kind of interesting. In 1917, Congress passed a law making a federal offense to threaten to kill the President of the United States. 1917, they made a federal offense to threaten to kill him. The law didn't cover the killing of the president, only the threatening to kill the president. Okay? So, in 1965, 2 years after Kennedy's assassination, Congress finally passed a law making it a federal offense to kill the President of the United States. You realize that Lee Harvey Oswald, that was not a federal offense when he shot Kennedy? Because it wasn't until 1965 they changed the law. Before it was to threaten to kill. Now, Kennedy was the 4th president to die at the hands of an assassin. Let's just quit shuffling and listen, okay? Listen to this, kind of interesting. He's the 4th president to die at the hands of an assassin. Who was the first one? Lincoln. He was elected in 1860. Who was the second one? Anybody know? Garfield, elected in 1880. How about the next one? McKinley, 1900. And Kennedy, 1960. All 4 presidents assassinated were elected in a 0 year. Okay? Now, there's been 7 presidents to die in office. William Henry Harrison died of pneumonia just, a week or so after his inauguration. What year was he elected? 1840. Lincoln died in 1860, Garfield died in 1880, McKinley died in 1900. Warren Harding died in office. He was elected in 1920. Franklin Roosevelt died in office, and one of his 4 elections was 1940, and Kennedy. So every president that's died in office has died being elected in a 0 year. Okay? Actually, Ronald Reagan's attempted assassination, he didn't get killed, but when was he elected? 1980. Now we'll get into the famous, and you might know these, the famous Lincoln Kennedy. I'm going to read them to you. Okay, here we go. Listen to these and I'll give you a copy. Lincoln Kennedy coincidences. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846, Kennedy in 1946, 100 years apart. Lincoln was elected president in 1860, Kennedy 1960, 100 years apart. Both men were deeply involved in civil rights for Negroes. Both men were assassinated on a Friday. Both men were assassinated in the presence of their wives. Each wife lost a son while living in the White House. Lincoln was killed in Ford's Theater. Kennedy was killed in a Ford automobile, a Lincoln Continental. Both men were succeeded by vice presidents named Johnson. Both vice presidents were Southern Democrats. Both vice presidents were former senators. Andrew Johnson, who replaced Lincoln, was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson, who replaced Kennedy, was born in 1908, 100 years apart. The last name of Kennedy's private secretary was Evelyn Lincoln. The first name of Lincoln's private secretary was John. John Wilkes Booth, who shot Lincoln, was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939, 100 years apart. Both assassins were murdered before being brought to trial. Booth shot President Lincoln from a theater. Oswald was apprehended in a theater. The name Lincoln and the name Kennedy each have 7 letters. The name Johnson and Johnson obviously have 7 letters, but Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson have 13 letters. And Lee Harvey Oswald and John Wilkes Booth each have 15 letters. So there you are. I got one more, but I'll tell you after you graduate, so don't get fired.
Conspiracy.
Anyway, put this in your group of good stuff. We are done with notes. We will have a quiz tomorrow.
Wait, I thought we scrapped it.
We did for the other one.
So basically the president of 2060 screwed. Is that what we're saying right now? 2060 screwed?
Maybe.
2020.
Hey, you know better than that. All you have. Hey, here's what we're gonna do. Here's what we're gonna do. Everybody gonna be here Wednesday? Anybody gonna be gone Wednesday? Okay, have a little review tomorrow morning. We get here. Won't take very long. We'll start the video I want to watch you. That's the CBS deal, and we'll do that the rest of the week. Okay. And then we'll have a quiz on Wednesday. Then we'll just have the quiz in here, and then we'll come back and watch the movie. Okay? All right, so there we go. Won't be that big of a deal, but I got to get a grade in the grade book. And we'll just leave old Shelby Lovey's crap here. I'm getting crushed. Yeah. Well, you know, the good news about that is they know. Because it's about people that we covered, so I don't mind losing if they're learning. Well, I have to pick the name, and then they go through and pick it. If they get it, then they get a point. If they don't get it before they get hung, then I get a point. Yeah.
Whose signatures are on the back of that?
Oh, I think Tyler Tashima signed it last year.
I thought they were important.
And Bobby Bryant. I don't know why, but Okay, proud winner of the Clint Hill autograph. Who else likes Clint Hill?
I like
Who would be interested in me picking a number and then the closest to it gets it?
I'd be entertained, I guess.
What's it between?
1 and 100. Okay. What?
I was gonna pick
Oh my God.
We're done.
How could I have seen that?
How about a Winston Lawson autograph?
You can't just say, yeah.
Anybody into Winston Lawson?
That's what we're saying.
Can I say the first one this time?
Okay, we'll start over here.
1 through what?
1 through 100. 60.
49.
Oh,
Okay.
16.
Oh,
Okay.
80.
23.
52.
32.
45.
27.
You said my number like 50 times.
That's
Everybody say 23? No.
50. Yes, I did. 12. I said 23.
I said
can't even
97.
read
Say
that.
97.
What is it?
What's that?
97? I was gonna say
Winston
97.
Lawson, right?
Because that's 3.
All right, who'd be interested in Hugh Ainsworth?
If you write the number, maybe we can get it wrong.
You can't see. He's winging it.
Okay,
49. 3.
71.
28.
42. 37.
12.
33. 16.
52. 42.
75. 63.
80.
51.
7. What did you say?
3.
You said 3 and she, so you
That's
both,
closer. That's closer.
That's 4, wait, that's 3.
7, 8, 9,
Is
10.
that a 9?
7, what'd you say?
10.
What'd you say?
3.
So that's 4 and that's 3.
Yeah.
It was pretty close. All right, well, yeah, I got a whole bunch more Hugh Ainsworths here. I got
Let's keep going. I'm feeling lucky.
I got 5 left, we'll continue on. Save those, now don't put those, if you, make sure you keep those down. They're worth money. Get on eBay and see what those are worth. One thing and more to give you before you go, I want you just to kind of look through it, and we'll talk about it a little bit tomorrow during our review. This is the Warren Commission, rather than make you take notes, I'm gonna give you mine. But I do want you to read it and be prepared tomorrow, so we can discuss it. Another one? These are my notes on the Warren Commission. So read through this for tomorrow so that you know what we're talking about briefly. I just thought it might be easier for you to have my notes. So you don't have to take some more notes. How's that? I will tell you one more thing before I quit today. We'll have to shorten some things, so there'll be time to time I'll give you my notes on things, yeah? No, we're all warned. We're all warned.